Jack the Ripper is a notorious, unidentified serial killer who terrorized the Whitechapel district of London, England in 1888. Over the course of several months, the Ripper is believed to have killed at least 5 women, all of whom were prostitutes. His methods were brutal, often involving the use of a knife to slash the throats and abdomens of his victims. The Ripper is believed to have killed at least 5 women, although some sources suggest that he may have been responsible for more deaths. The first known victim of Jack the Ripper was Mary Ann Nichols, who was found dead on August 31, 1888. Nichols had been seen earlier that night soliciting customers in the Whitechapel area, and her body was discovered in a narrow alleyway in the early hours of the morning. Her throat had been cut and her abdomen had been mutilated. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was killed on September 8, 1888. Chapman was also a prostitute, and her body was found in the backyard of a boarding house in the Whitechapel district. Her throat had been slashed and her abdomen had been cut open, with some of her organs removed. The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was killed on September 30, 1888. Stride's body was found in Dutfield's yard, a narrow passageway in Whitechapel. Her throat had been slashed, but her body had not been mutilated like the previous victims. One possible explanation is that the Ripper was interrupted during his attack and had to flee the scene before he could carry out his usual mutilations. This may be why later that same night, the Ripper claimed his fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, with her throat slashed and her body mutilated. Mary Jane Kelly, who was widely believed to be the Ripper's final victim, was found dead in her room at 13 Miller's Court on November 9, 1888. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition and is considered by many to be the most horrific of all the Ripper's crimes. The deaths of Ripper's victims shocked London society and sparked a frenzy of media coverage, with newspapers publishing sensationalized accounts of the killings and speculating on the identity of the killer. Despite an intense investigation, the police were unable to identify a suspect, and the killings eventually stopped. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery to this day, and the case has spawned numerous theories and speculations. One of the earliest suspects was Montague John Drude, a barrister and teacher who was found dead in the Thames River in December 1888. Drude had a history of mental illness, and some speculated that he may have committed suicide after the murders. However, there is little evidence linking him to the killings, and he is now considered a relatively minor suspect. Another suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew who lived in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. Kosminski was committed to an asylum in 1891, and some contemporary police officers believed that he was the Ripper. However, there is no definitive evidence to support this theory. A more recent suspect is Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was living in London at the time of the murders. Tumblety was known to have a deep hatred of women and was arrested on charges of homosexuality shortly after the murders. Some researchers believe that Tumblety may have been the Ripper, but others dispute this theory. Another popular suspect is Sir William Gull, a physician who served as the personal physician to Queen Victoria. Some have speculated that Gull was part of a Masonic conspiracy to cover up the Ripper's identity, and that he may have been responsible for the murders himself. However, this theory has been widely discredited. Finally, there is the theory that Jack the Ripper was actually a woman. This theory is based on the fact that some of the murders were committed with a level of surgical skill that was unusual for the time, and that the Ripper was able to approach his victims without raising suspicion. However, there is little evidence to support this theory. In the end, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery, and the case has become one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in history. Despite the efforts of countless investigators, it seems that the Ripper's true identity will never be known for certain, and his gruesome crimes will continue to fascinate and horrify people for generations to come. In the crowded streets of Victorian London, there lived a man named Edward who had always been an outcast. Born into poverty and abuse, Edward was forced to fend for himself from a young age. He learned to steal and lie to survive, and as he grew older, his criminal activities became more and more violent. Despite his rough exterior, Edward was intelligent and well-read. He often spent his evenings in the public library, poring over medical textbooks and studying the human anatomy. He became fascinated with the idea of surgery, and he longed to become a doctor himself. However, due to his lack of formal education and his criminal record, Edward was never able to achieve his dream of becoming a doctor. Instead, he took to the streets, using his knowledge of the human body to become a skilled killer. Edward's first victim was a prostitute who had caught his eye. He lured her into a dark alley and slit her throat, relishing in the power he felt over her. From there, he continued to hunt down and kill women, always selecting his victims from the seedy alleys and brothels of London's East End. Despite his gruesome crimes, Edward managed to avoid detection for many years. He was always careful to leave no trace behind, and he moved frequently to avoid suspicion. He even managed to secure a job as an orderly in a local hospital, which allowed him access to medical supplies and information. As the years went on, Edward's crimes became more and more brazen. He taunted the police with letters and messages, and he even left behind pieces of his victims' bodies as macabre trophies. Edward continued his violent activities, slipping through the streets of London like a phantom, stalking his prey and disappearing into the shadows without a trace. However, unknown to Edward, the tides of fate were about to turn against him. One evening, while prowling the dark alleys of Whitechapel, Edward set his sights on a young woman who was walking home alone. He followed her for several blocks, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Little did he know, Mary was not working the streets of Whitechapel, but was returning home with cold remedies she picked up from a pharmacy. A deadly strain of influenza was spreading through England, which Mary had picked up from one of her clients. As she turned to enter her home, Edward closed in for the kill. Without a second thought, Edward pounced on Mary, slashing her throat with his trusty blade. The poor woman was already weak from her illness and had no chance of fighting back. But what made her killing particularly gruesome was the fact that she coughed in Edward's face during the attack. Enraged by the thought of contracting the deadly influenza strain, Edward went into a frenzy, mutilating her body beyond recognition. At first, Edward thought he had gotten away with the murder unscathed, but within a few days, he began to feel unwell. He developed a high fever and a hacking cough that wouldn't go away. He tried to continue his killing spree, but found himself growing weaker with each passing day. Finally, unable to go on any longer, Edward collapsed in a dirty alleyway, coughing up blood and gasping for air. He knew that he was dying, and with his last breath, he whispered a final confession to the heavens above. The authorities eventually found his body, but by that time, the mystery of Jack the Ripper had already captured the public imagination. Edward's death put an end to his killing spree, but it did little to quell the fear and anxiety that gripped the people of Victorian London. In the years since his death, countless theories have been proposed about the true identity of Jack the Ripper. Some have suggested that Edward was the killer, while others have pointed the finger at other suspects. But regardless of who was responsible for the brutal crimes that terrorized London in the late 19th century, the legacy of Jack the Ripper continues to fascinate and intrigue people around the world to this day.